Hello and welcome to Ironwad Whispers, your corner where stories come alive and speak to the soul. Let us know in the comment where you're listening from. I'd love to see our community grow and connect worldwide. And if you enjoy this story, be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss a story. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Once upon a time, there was a billionaire who lived in a world of riches, but carried a heart as lonely as the night sky. He believed love was a fairy tale for the weak, something that could never touch him. But destiny has a gentle way of surprising even the coldest souls. For when a beautiful maiden crossed his path, her smile lit up the darkness he thought would last forever. And with every heartbeat, she began to awaken a part of him he never knew existed. Sebastian Knott stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Philadelphia penthouse, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars against the evening sky. At 32, he had built TechVault, the second-largest e-commerce platform in North America, from a college dorm room idea into a multi-billion-dollar empire. His steel-blue eyes reflected in the glass, a face that graced business magazines monthly, yet held no warmth for the world beyond profit margins. The notification on his phone buzzed for the 15th time that evening. Another message from his mother about meeting someone, finding happiness, building a family. He deleted it without reading, just as he had done with the previous 14. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness that destroyed empires and clouded judgment. He had learned that lesson watching his father lose everything in a bitter divorce when Sebastian was 12. His assistant knocked and entered, placing a stack of acquisition proposals on his desk. "The board meeting is at 7 tomorrow morning, Mr. Knott. The merger documents for the European expansion are ready for your review." Sebastian nodded without turning from the window. Tomorrow would bring another conquest, another victory in his relentless pursuit of dominance in the digital marketplace. Love had no place in his equation for success. Celine Throne wiped the sweat from her brow as she loaded the last package into her delivery van. 3 years of working for quick-drop delivery services had taught her every shortcut in Philadelphia. But today's route included a new stop: the infamous TechVault headquarters. The building rose like a glass monument to capitalism, its modern architecture both beautiful and intimidating. She had heard stories about Sebastian Knott from other drivers who'd made deliveries to his office. They spoke of a man who never smiled, never thanked anyone, and fired employees for the smallest mistakes. But Celine didn't believe in rumors. Her grandmother had taught her that everyone had a story, a reason for their walls, and that kindness could crack even the toughest exterior. The package she carried was different from the usual corporate deliveries, a small hand-wrapped box addressed personally to Sebastian Knott, marked fragile and urgent. The return address was from a hospice in Colorado. As she entered the building's impressive lobby, she couldn't shake the feeling that this delivery would change something, though she couldn't imagine what. Sebastian was reviewing quarterly reports when his phone rang. His secretary's nervous voice filled the line. "Mr. Knott, there's a delivery person insisting on handing you a package personally. She says it's from Mountain View Hospice regarding your Uncle Thomas." The name hit him like a physical blow. Uncle Thomas, the only family member who had ever shown him unconditional kindness, who had taught him to fish during summers in Colorado, who had believed in him when everyone else had written him off as his father's bitter son. Sebastian hadn't spoken to him in 5 years, too busy building his empire to return calls or visit. He took the executive elevator down to the lobby, his mind racing. When the doors opened, he nearly collided with a young woman holding a small package. Her honey-colored eyes met his, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. She had an unusual beauty, Not the polished, artificial perfection he was accustomed to seeing, but something genuine and warm. "Mr. Knott?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Celine Throne. I have something important for you." Sebastian's hands trembled slightly as he took the package, though he masked it with his usual stoic expression. Celine noticed the micro-movement, the first crack in his supposedly impenetrable armor. "Would you like me to wait while you open it?" she asked gently. Sometimes difficult news is easier with someone nearby. He wanted to dismiss her, to retreat to his office and face whatever this was alone, as he always did. But something in her eyes, a genuine compassion that expected nothing in return, made him nod. They sat in the lobby's seating area, an oddly intimate moment in the vast corporate space. Inside the package was a letter in his uncle's shaky handwriting and a worn leather journal. The letter was brief, Sebastian. "My boy, I'm at the end of my journey. I leave you my journal, filled with the only wealth that matters, the love stories of our family, including your parents before things went wrong. Don't let bitterness steal your chance at happiness. Love isn't weakness, it's the only strength that matters. Uncle Thomas." Sebastian felt moisture in his eyes for the first time in 20 years. Celine watched as the notorious cold-hearted billionaire struggled with emotion. Without thinking, she reached out and gently touched his hand. "I'm sorry for your loss," she whispered. Sebastian looked at their touching hands as if seeing human contact for the first time. "He's not. The letter doesn't say he's gone yet," Sebastian managed, his voice rougher than usual. "But he's in hospice. I need to go to Colorado." The words came out fragmented, uncertain, so unlike the commanding CEO the world knew. He looked at Celine suddenly, an idea forming. "You deliver packages. Do you ever do long-distance runs?" Celine blinked in surprise. "I have my commercial license, yes, but—" Sebastian interrupted. "I'll pay you $10,000 to drive me to Colorado. I need to leave immediately, and I can't face this alone." The admission cost him. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened. Here was a man who had built walls so high he'd forgotten how to ask for help. Yet something about this moment, this loss, had broken through his defenses. Within 2 hours, Celine found herself behind the wheel of a rented luxury SUV, Sebastian Knott in the passenger seat, heading west on Interstate 76. She had called her boss, who nearly had a heart attack when she explained who had hired her for a private delivery run. Sebastian had been silent for the first hour, staring at the journal without opening it. "You must think I'm pathetic," he finally said, his voice barely audible over the road noise. "A grown man who can't drive himself to say goodbye to his dying uncle." Celine glanced at him, seeing vulnerability in those famous grey eyes. "I think you're human," she replied simply. "And humans need other humans, especially during the difficult times." Sebastian studied her profile as she drove. She was nothing like the women in his world. No designer clothes, no calculated moves, no agenda. Her kindness seemed reflexive, natural, like breathing. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked. "The money," she said, then smiled slightly. "And because you looked like someone who hadn't asked for help in a very long time. My grandmother always said, those are the people who need it most." As Pennsylvania gave way to Ohio, Sebastian finally opened the journal. His uncle's younger handwriting filled the pages with family stories Sebastian had never heard. Stories of his grandparents meeting at a dance hall in 1952, of great aunts and uncles who risked everything for love, of couples who weathered poverty, war, and loss together. "Read some aloud," Celine suggested when she noticed him becoming absorbed. "It helps pass the time." Sebastian hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing anything personal, but found himself reading about his parents' early courtship. His father had been romantic once, writing poetry for his mother, planning elaborate surprises. It was nothing like the bitter man Sebastian remembered from the divorce. Celine listened without judgment, as Sebastian's voice grew thick with emotion. When he stopped reading, unable to continue, she shared her own story. My parents died in a car accident when I was 7. My grandmother raised me on stories too. Stories about how love survives even death, how it transforms into memory and strength. Your uncle is giving you a gift, showing you that your family knew love before it knew pain. They had just crossed into Indiana when the weather turned violent. Rain hammered the windshield as Celine struggled to see the road. Sebastian watched her hands steady on the wheel, her complete focus on keeping them safe. "There's a motel at the next exit," he said, checking his phone. "We should stop." The motel was nothing like the 5-star hotel Sebastian usually frequented, but Celine made it feel less foreign with her easy smile at the desk clerk and her joke about the vintage decor. They got 2 rooms side by side, and Sebastian found himself reluctant to separate. "Would you have dinner with me?" he asked, gesturing to the small diner attached to the motel. "I'd like to hear more about your grandmother." Over burgers and milkshakes, food Sebastian hadn't eaten in years. Celine painted a picture of a woman who had raised her with infinite patience and wisdom. She used to say that hearts were like safes. Some people lose the combination to their own and spend their whole lives locked out. She looked at Sebastian meaningfully. But the combination is always there, waiting to be remembered. The storm worsened, rattling the windows of the old motel. Sebastian found himself unable to sleep, haunted by the journal's revelations and the ticking clock of his uncle's remaining time. He heard a soft knock on the connecting door between their rooms. "Can't sleep either?" Celine's voice came through. He opened the door to find her wrapped in a blanket, holding 2 cups of tea she'd made with the room's coffee maker. They sat on his bed, backs against the headboard, like old friends rather than strangers who'd met just that morning. "Tell me about Tech Vault," she said. "How does someone so young build something so massive?" Sebastian found himself telling her everything. The 18-hour days, the betrayals by partners, the loneliness of success. "I convinced myself that emotional isolation was the price of achievement," he admitted. "But reading this journal, seeing how full my uncle's life was with love and connection, I wonder if I've been the poorest man in Philadelphia all along." Celine didn't offer platitudes or disagree. She simply listened, and somehow her presence made the truth less frightening. Sebastian woke to find himself still sitting against the headboard, Celine asleep with her head on his shoulder. For a moment, he didn't move, afraid to disturb this unexpected peace. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been this close to another person without it being calculated or transactional. She stirred, immediately apologizing and pulling away, but he caught her hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the company." For listening, their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Celine looked away first, standing and stretching. "We should get going. Your uncle is waiting." As they loaded the car, the motel owner mentioned the storm had washed out part of the interstate. They'd need to take back roads through rural Indiana and Illinois, adding hours to their journey. Sebastian would normally have been frustrated by the delay, but found himself oddly grateful for more time in this bubble with Celine, away from his corporate world and all its empty promises. The back roads took them through small towns Sebastian had only seen from 30,000 feet above. Celine stopped at a farmer's market, insisting they needed real food for the journey. Sebastian followed her through the stalls, watching her chat with vendors, sampling homemade preserves, her face lighting up at simple pleasures. "Try this," she said, holding up a spoonful of honey to his lips. The intimacy of the gesture should have made him uncomfortable, but instead he found himself leaning in, tasting the sweetness. An elderly vendor winked at them. "You two make a lovely couple. How long have you been together?" Before Sebastian could correct her, Celine laughed. "We're still figuring that out." Back in the car, Sebastian asked, "Why didn't you correct her?" Celine glanced at him while merging onto another country road. "Because for a moment, it felt nice to pretend we were normal people on a normal road trip, didn't it?" He realized she was right. For the first time in his life, he wanted to be just Sebastian, not the billionaire. They were in the middle of Illinois farmland when the SUV suddenly sputtered and died. Celine managed to coast to the shoulder before the engine completely gave out. Sebastian immediately reached for his phone to call his assistant, to have another car sent, to fix this with money and influence. But there was no signal. "Looks like we walk," Celine said cheerfully, pointing to a farmhouse about a mile down the road. Sebastian stared at her in disbelief. "Walk? I don't walk. I have people who walk for me." She laughed, actually laughed at his indignation. "Well, Mr. Knott, today you're people. Come on, it's an adventure." As they walked through the wheat fields, Sebastian found his Italian leather shoes covered in dust, his designer shirt damp with sweat, and surprisingly, he didn't care. Celine was telling him about her failed attempt to start her own delivery business, how she'd lost everything but kept going. "Failure isn't the opposite of success," she said. "It's just part of the journey." He wondered when he'd stopped believing that, when he'd become so afraid of failure that he'd stopped taking any risks that mattered. The farmhouse belonged to the Johnsons, an elderly couple who invited them in without hesitation. While Mr. Johnson called his mechanic son, Mrs. Johnson insisted they stay for lunch. Sebastian watched Celine help in the kitchen, moving naturally in this simple domestic scene. She caught him staring and smiled, flour dusting her cheek. "Your girlfriend's a keeper," Mrs. Johnson told Sebastian quietly. "She's not my—" he started, then stopped. "What was she, his hired driver?" That didn't explain the way his chest tightened when she laughed, or how he found himself moving closer to her without conscious thought. "She's special," he finished simply. The mechanic's son arrived and diagnosed a blown head gasket. It would take until tomorrow to get parts. The Johnsons offered their guest room, but there was only one. "We'll find a hotel," Sebastian said, but Mr. Johnson shook his head. "Nearest hotel is 50 miles. You're welcome here." Celine looked at Sebastian, a question in her eyes. He nodded. One more night in this alternate reality couldn't hurt. That evening, Sebastian found himself doing things he hadn't done since childhood. He helped Mr. Johnson feed the chickens, listening to stories about farming life. He watched Celine learn to milk a cow, her delighted laughter when she succeeded making him smile genuinely for the first time in years. After dinner, they all sat on the porch watching fireflies. Mrs. Johnson brought out a guitar, and to Sebastian's surprise, Celine could play. She sang an old folk song about love and loss, her voice clear and haunting in the summer evening. Sebastian felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he'd built so carefully beginning to crumble. When it was time for bed, they stood awkwardly in the guest room, with its one queen bed. "I can sleep on the floor," Sebastian offered, but Celine shook her head. "We're adults. We can share a bed without it being complicated." But as they lay there in the darkness, listening to crickets and distant thunder, Sebastian knew it was already complicated. Everything about Celine Throne was complicated in the most beautifully simple way. Thunder crashed overhead, and Celine shifted closer to Sebastian unconsciously. "Scared of storms?" he asked softly. "Not scared," she replied. "They just make me feel small. Remind me how little control we really have. He understood that feeling, had spent his entire adult life trying to control everything, everyone. My uncle used to tell me storms were nature's way of cleaning the slate, Sebastian said, surprising himself by sharing the memory. He said they washed away what needed to go and nourished what needed to grow. Celine turned to face him in the darkness. He sounds wise. He is. I hope he still is. The vulnerability in his voice made Celine reach out, finding his hand between them. We'll get there in time, she promised. You'll get to say goodbye. Sebastian squeezed her hand, holding on like an anchor. What if he doesn't forgive me? For staying away? For choosing money over family? Then you'll forgive yourself, she said simply, and you'll do better going forward. That's all any of us can do. Sebastian woke before dawn. Celine curled against his side. He should have felt trapped, panicked by the intimacy. Instead, he felt a peace he'd never known. Carefully, not wanting to wake her, he slipped out and walked onto the porch, watching the sun rise over the cornfields. Mr. Johnson joined him with 2 cups of coffee. Been married 47 years, the old man said without preamble. Want to know the secret? Sebastian found himself nodding. It's not about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be better, then doing the work to become that person. When Celine emerged, hair tousled and smiling, Sebastian felt that want like a physical ache. She made him want to be someone who deserved morning smiles and gentle touches. The mechanic arrived with parts, and soon they were ready to leave. Mrs. Johnson packed them food for the road, refusing Sebastian's attempts to pay. Some things can't be bought, she said firmly. Kindness is one of them. As they crossed the state line into Colorado, Sebastian grew increasingly tense. They were only hours from the hospice now, hours from facing his dying uncle and all his regrets. Celine pulled over at a scenic overlook, the Rocky Mountains spreading before them in majestic silence. Tell me about him, she said. Not the regrets, but the good memories. Sebastian found himself talking about summers fishing, about his uncle teaching him to tie flies, to read the water, to be patient. He never had children of his own, Sebastian explained. Said I was all the son he needed, and I abandoned him. You didn't abandon him, Celine said firmly. You lost your way. There's a difference. Abandonment is permanent. This, she gestured to their journey, this is finding your way back. She stood close to him as they looked at the mountains, and Sebastian found himself putting his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him naturally, and they stood that way for a long time, drawing strength from each other. Mountain View Hospice was a peaceful place, surrounded by gardens and mountain views. Sebastian's legs felt leaden as they walked to the entrance. Celine stayed by his side, not touching but present, a steady warmth he could feel without contact. The nurse at the desk smiled sadly when Sebastian gave his name. He's been waiting for you. He said you'd come. Uncle Thomas was smaller than Sebastian remembered, diminished by illness but still recognizable. His eyes, the same grey as Sebastian's, lit up when he saw his nephew. My boy, he whispered, voice weak but warm. You came. Sebastian couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, so he just took his uncle's frail hand. And who is this? Thomas asked, noticing Celine. Before Sebastian could explain, his uncle smiled. Ah, I see it. The way you stand together. You found her, didn't you? The one who could thaw that frozen heart of yours. Celine blushed, but didn't correct him. Neither did Sebastian. Some truths were felt before they were acknowledged. Thomas was having a good day, the nurse said, alert and relatively pain-free. He wanted to hear about TechVault, about Sebastian's success, but, more importantly, about the journey here. Tell me about this young lady who got you to leave your office, he said with a knowing smile. Sebastian found himself telling the story, with Celine adding details he'd forgotten or hadn't noticed. Thomas laughed at the farmhouse adventure, nodded approvingly at Celine's wisdom about storms and forgiveness. "You remind me of my Sarah," he told Celine, "my late wife. She had that same gift of seeing through the walls people build." "I need your forgiveness," Sebastian said suddenly. "For not visiting, for not calling, for choosing work over family." Thomas squeezed his hand weakly. "There's nothing to forgive, son. We all walk our own paths. I'm just grateful yours led you back here before the end, and that you didn't walk it alone." Thomas asked the nurse to bring a box from his closet. Inside were photographs, letters, and a small velvet box. "These are all I have left of value," he said. "The pictures are of your father before the bitterness, of your mother before the pain. Remember them this way." He handed Sebastian the letters. "These are the love letters I wrote Sarah but never sent, too afraid of rejection. Don't make my mistake." Finally, he opened the velvet box, revealing a simple gold ring with a small sapphire. This was Sarah's. She wanted it to go to the woman who finally taught you that love isn't weakness. He looked at Celine. "I think she would have liked you very much." Celine's eyes filled with tears as Thomas placed the ring in Sebastian's palm, closing his fingers over it. They stayed until Thomas fell asleep, his breathing shallow but peaceful. The nurse promised to call if anything changed. As they left, Sebastian felt lighter and heavier simultaneously. Lighter for the forgiveness, heavier for the impending loss. Celine took his hand in the parking lot, and he held on like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to earth. Sebastian booked them rooms at a nearby hotel, unable to face the drive back immediately. They had dinner in relative silence, both processing the emotional weight of the day. "He's wonderful," Celine finally said. "I see where you get your strength." Sebastian laughed bitterly. "I'm not strong. I'm a coward who hides behind money and power." "No," Celine said firmly. "You're someone who was hurt and built walls to prevent more hurt. That's not cowardice, it's survival. Cowardice would be never trying to tear them down." She reached across the table, taking his hand. "You're here, aren't you? Facing your pain, your regrets. That takes incredible courage." Later, standing at her hotel room door, Sebastian found himself reluctant to say goodnight. "Would you stay with me?" he asked quietly. "Not for... just to be there." "I don't want to be alone tonight." Celine nodded, understanding. They lay fully clothed on his bed, Sebastian telling stories about his uncle until his voice grew thick with unshed tears. Celine held him then, this powerful billionaire who'd forgotten how to be vulnerable, and he let himself be held. The phone rang at 3 a.m. Sebastian knew before answering. Thomas had passed peacefully in his sleep, the nurse said. No pain, just slipped away. Sebastian sat on the edge of the bed, phone still in his hand, unable to process the finality of it. Celine sat beside him, not speaking, just present. "I thought I'd have more time," he said finally. "To make up for the lost years, to learn from him, to become the man he believed I could be." Celine took his face in her hands, making him look at her. "You have the rest of your life to become that man. He gave you the tools, the journal, the stories, the reminder that love is strength. Honor him by using them." Sebastian kissed her then, sudden and desperate, pouring all his grief and gratitude into the connection. She kissed him back, gentle but grounding, pulling him back from the edge of despair. When they separated, both breathing heavily, she whispered, "I'm here. For whatever you need, I'm here." The next days blurred together. Funeral arrangements, lawyers, sorting through Thomas's few possessions. Celine stayed, calling her boss to extend her leave. She was a quiet, steady presence, handling small details Sebastian couldn't focus on, making sure he ate, slept, functioned. The funeral was small. A few old friends, neighbors from Thomas's apartment building, and surprisingly, several people Thomas had helped over the years. They all had stories of his kindness, his wisdom, his quiet generosity. Sebastian realized he'd known only a fraction of the man his uncle had been. "He talked about you constantly," an elderly woman told Sebastian. "So proud of your success, but worried about your heart. He said you'd inherited your father's tendency to choose isolation over risk. He prayed you'd find someone to change that." Her eyes moved to Celine, who was arranging flowers by the casket. Looks like his prayers were answered. Thomas had left everything to Sebastian, not much in monetary terms, but rich in meaning. The fishing gear they'd used during those summer trips, his library of first-edition poetry books, and, surprisingly, a small cabin in the mountains he'd never mentioned. The lawyer handed over the deed and a letter. Sebastian read it aloud to Celine later, sitting in Thomas's empty apartment. "Sebastian, the cabin was my sanctuary, where Sarah and I spent our happiest days. I never told you about it because I was saving it for when you were ready, when you had someone to share it with. Life is meant to be shared, my boy. Don't wait until it's too late to learn that lesson." They drove to the cabin that afternoon. It was small but beautiful, overlooking a pristine lake, surrounded by aspens and pines. Inside, it was frozen in time, photos of Thomas and Sarah, handmade quilts, a stone fireplace. "It's perfect," Celine breathed. Sebastian watched her explore, touching things gently, reverently. He could imagine her here. Imagine them here, away from his corporate world. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. They stayed at the cabin that night, building a fire, cooking simple food, existing in a bubble outside of reality. Sitting on the porch, watching stars reflect on the lake, Sebastian found himself talking about things he'd never told anyone. His father's rage during the divorce, his mother's depression, the loneliness of building an empire. "I convinced myself that success would fill the emptiness," he said, "that if I had enough money, enough power, I'd never be vulnerable again. But Thomas was right. I just built a very expensive prison." Celine listened, her hand in his, thumb tracing circles on his palm. "What do you want now?" she asked. "If you could have anything, be anyone, what would you choose?" Sebastian looked at her, moonlight painting her features in silver and shadow. "I want to be someone who deserves you," he said quietly. "Someone who chooses love over fear, connection over control. I want to be the man Thomas believed I could be." Celine kissed him softly. "You already are. You just need to believe it too." They couldn't stay at the cabin forever, though Sebastian wanted to. Reality waited in Philadelphia, his company, her job, their separate lives. As they drove back, Sebastian felt the weight of impending separation. How could he return to his sterile penthouse, his emotionless existence, after experiencing this? "This doesn't have to end," Celine said, reading his mood as she'd learned to do. "We live in the same city. We can see each other." But Sebastian knew it wouldn't be the same. In his world, she'd be consumed by the machine of his life. The press, the social expectations, the constant demands. "You don't understand what being with me would mean," he said. "The scrutiny, the pressure, the loss of privacy." "Then show me," she challenged. "Let me decide if it's worth it." "Don't make that choice for me." Her fierce independence, her refusal to be protected or patronized, made him fall a little more in love with her. Love. The word sat in his mind, foreign but increasingly familiar. Philadelphia looked different through the windshield, more prison than kingdom. Sebastian's phone had been off for days, and when he turned it on, it exploded with messages, emails, crises that needed his attention. He watched his corporate mask slide back into place, felt his walls rebuilding automatically. Celine pulled up to his building, the same spot where she'd first delivered that life-changing package. "Thank you," Sebastian said formally, reaching for his wallet. She stopped his hand. "Don't you dare try to pay me. This stopped being a job days ago." The hurt in her eyes made him flinch. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to be that person from the cabin, and this person," he gestured to the towering building. "How to merge those worlds." Celine studied him for a long moment, then figure it out. "You built a billion-dollar company from nothing. Surely you can figure out how to have a relationship." She drove away, leaving him standing on the sidewalk, feeling poorer than he'd ever been despite his billions. His penthouse felt like a mausoleum. Every surface reflected his isolation back at him. The unused kitchen, the empty guest rooms, the bed that had never been shared. Sebastian stood at the windows, looking down at the city, and wondered when his sanctuary had become a prison. He opened Thomas's journal again, reading an entry about choosing love despite fear. "Sarah terrifies me," his uncle had written. "She makes me want to be better, to risk my comfortable loneliness for the chaos of connection. I'm going to ask her to marry me tomorrow. If she says no, I'll survive. But if I don't ask, I'll die a little every day for the rest of my life." Sebastian picked up his phone, then put it down. Picked it up again. Finally, he typed a message to Celine. "I'm trying to figure it out. Don't give up on me." Her response came quickly. "I'm not going anywhere. Take your time. The best things are worth waiting for." He smiled, the expression feeling strange on his face, after days of corporate meetings where smiling was weakness. Sebastian shocked his board by proposing a complete restructuring of company culture. Mandatory vacation time, mental health support, work-life balance initiatives. "We're burning out our best people," he argued. "Success without sustainability is just delayed failure." The board resisted, citing profit concerns, until Sebastian showed them studies linking employee happiness to productivity. His assistant, Margaret, nearly fainted when he asked about her family, remembered her daughter's name, gave her a raise without being asked. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" she asked carefully. "I'm trying something new," he replied. Being human, word spread quickly through the company. Sebastian Knott was changing. Some attributed it to his uncle's death, others whispered about a woman. The truth was both and neither. He was changing because he'd finally understood that his empire meant nothing if he had no one to share it with. That success without connection was just elaborate failure. 2 weeks after their return, Celine appeared at his office. She wore her delivery uniform, carried a package, but her smile was personal. "Delivery for Sebastian Knott," she said formally to Margaret, who buzzed her in immediately, recognizing her from security footage and office gossip. Sebastian stood when she entered, his heart racing like a teenager's. "What are you delivering?" he asked. She handed him the package. It was the ring box from Thomas, which he'd left in her car. "You forgot this," she said, though I suspect it wasn't really forgetting so much as not knowing what to do with it. "It's yours," he said suddenly. "Thomas meant it for you. He saw what I was too scared to see, that you're the one who brought me back to life." Celine shook her head. "It's not mine until you give it to me for the right reasons. Not because your uncle said so, not because you're grieving, but because you choose to. When you're ready." She kissed his cheek and left, leaving him holding the ring and wondering when he'd know he was ready. Sebastian had to fly to Seattle for a major acquisition meeting. For the first time in his career, he didn't want to go. He wanted to stay in Philadelphia to figure out how to bridge the gap between himself and Celine. But duty called, and he'd built his life on answering that call. The meeting was a disaster. The company they were acquiring had a family culture, employees who loved their work, a CEO who knew everyone's name. They looked at Sebastian like he was a corporate vampire, coming to drain their lifeblood. "We'd rather shut down than sell to Tech Vault," the CEO said flatly. "We've heard how you treat people." That night, in his Seattle hotel, Sebastian called Celine. "I'm failing," he admitted. "I'm trying to be different, but everyone sees the old me. How do I change a reputation built over years?" Her voice was gentle through the phone. "One person at a time, one decision at a time." "And Sebastian, you don't have to become someone else. Just let people see who you really are. The man who sat with me through storms, who helped feed chickens, who held his dying uncle's hand. That man is worth knowing." Instead of strong-arming the acquisition, Sebastian did something unprecedented. He walked away. He called the CEO personally. "You're right. Tech Vault isn't the right fit for your company, but I'd like to propose a partnership instead. Keep your culture, your independence, but let us help with distribution and infrastructure." The CEO was suspicious, but intrigued. They met for coffee instead of in a boardroom. Sebastian told him about Thomas, about learning that success without humanity was hollow. "I'm trying to change," he admitted. "Not just the company, but myself. Maybe we can help each other flying back to Philadelphia." Sebastian felt lighter. He'd lost a potentially profitable acquisition, but gained something more valuable. The knowledge that he could choose differently, be different. He texted Celine from the plane. "I think I'm starting to figure it out. Can I see you when I land?" Her response was immediate. "I'll make dinner. My apartment, 7 p.m. Don't wear a suit." Celine's apartment was small but warm, filled with plants, books, photographs of her grandmother. It smelled like home cooking and felt like a real home, something Sebastian's penthouse had never achieved. She'd made spaghetti, simple but perfect, and they ate at her tiny kitchen table like normal people. "This is who I am," she said, gesturing around. "No penthouse, no design or anything. Just me, my grandmother's recipes, and a job I actually enjoy. If we're going to try this, you need to know what you're getting into." Sebastian looked around, seeing wealth his money couldn't buy. Comfort, warmth, authenticity. "And this is who I am," he said, loosening his collar despite her no-suit instruction. "Someone who wears suits to casual dinners, because I don't own casual clothes. Someone who's learning to be human at 32. Someone who's terrified of failing at this, but more terrified of not trying." Celine reached across the table, taking his hand. "Then we'll figure it out together. That's what people do when they care about each other." Celine invited Sebastian to her monthly game night with friends. He was terrified. Board meetings with hostile executives were easier than facing a group of normal people who knew nothing about him, except that he was dating their friend. They were skeptical at first. A billionaire CEO dating their Celine seemed like a recipe for heartbreak. But as the night wore on, Sebastian relaxed. He was terrible at charades, which delighted everyone. He listened more than he talked, asked genuine questions, and when Celine's best friend, Maria, grilled him about his intentions, he answered honestly, "I don't deserve her, but I'm trying to become someone who does by the end of the night." He was included in their inside jokes, invited to the next gathering, treated like a person rather than a bank account. "They like you," Celine said as they cleaned up. "The real you, not the billionaire. Just Sebastian." It was the first time in years he'd been liked for himself, and the feeling was intoxicating. They had their first real fight 3 months into dating. Sebastian had bought Celine a car, a luxury SUV to replace her aging delivery van. He'd meant it as a gesture of care, but she was furious. "You can't just buy me things because you think I need them," she said, pacing her apartment. "That's not how relationships work." "I have money," Sebastian argued, frustrated. "Why shouldn't I use it to make your life easier?" "Because," Celine said, tears in her eyes, "it makes me feel like a project, like something you're fixing." "I'm not broken, Sebastian. I don't need your money. I need your time, your attention, your emotional presence. Those are the things you can't buy." The fight lasted hours, both of them stumbling over old patterns and new attempts at vulnerability. Finally, exhausted, they sat on her couch in silence. "I don't know how to love without trying to control," Sebastian admitted. "Money is the only power I've ever trusted." Celine took his hand. "Then learn a new kind of power. The power of being equal partners, of giving and receiving, of trusting someone else to be strong too." To apologize for the car incident, Sebastian suggested a weekend at Thomas's cabin. No work, no phones, just them and the mountains. Celine agreed, and they drove up on a Friday afternoon, the aspens turning gold with approaching autumn. They spent the weekend like Thomas and Sarah might have. Fishing, Celine caught more. Hiking, Sebastian knew all the trails from childhood. Cooking together, reading by the fire. On Saturday night, they made love for the first time, slow and tender, a culmination of months of building trust and intimacy. Afterward, lying entwined in the old brass bed, Sebastian told her he loved her. The words came out unplanned, surprising him with their certainty. Celine smiled, tracing patterns on his chest. "I love you too. Not your money, not your success, not the potential of who you could be. You, Sebastian, just as you are, flaws and all." He held her tighter, feeling the last of his walls crumble into dust. Someone photographed them at the cabin, and suddenly their relationship was public. The headlines were predictable: Billionaire's working-class romance, beauty, and the businessman, from delivery girl to diamond ring. The invasion of privacy was overwhelming for Celine, who'd never experienced public scrutiny. Reporters camped outside her apartment, called her work, dug into her past. They found out about her parents' death, painted her as either a gold digger or a saint, depending on the narrative. Sebastian watched her withdraw, overwhelmed by the violation of her private life. "This is what I was afraid of," he said, holding her as she cried after a particularly invasive article about her grandmother. "We can control this," he said, shifting into CEO mode. "I'll hire PR people, security, whatever you need." But Celine shook her head. "I don't want to live in a fortress, Sebastian. I just want them to see us as people, not a story." That gave him an idea. If the media wanted a story, he'd give them one, but on their terms. Sebastian did something he'd never done, gave a personal interview. Not to a business magazine, but to a human interest journalist Celine respected. They did it together, in Celine's apartment, showing their real life rather than a manufactured image. They talked about Thomas, about the journey to Colorado, about learning to love after loss and fear. Celine spoke about her grandmother's influence, her work, her initial reluctance to date someone so wealthy. Sebastian was more vulnerable than he'd ever been publicly, admitting his failures, his fears, his journey toward becoming a better man. The article went viral, but for the right reasons. People connected with their honesty, their struggles, their very human love story. The harassment decreased, replaced by genuine interest and even support. "You gave them the truth," Celine said, reading the positive responses. "That's all people really want. The truth, Sebastian realized she was right. His whole life, he'd hidden behind image and power, but truth was the ultimate strength. Sebastian's mother had been calling incessantly since the article. Finally, he agreed to dinner, bringing Celine despite his mother's obvious preference for a private meeting. Victoria Knott was everything Celine wasn't. Polished, calculated, born to wealth even before marrying into more. The dinner was tense. Victoria questioned Celine about her education, state school, her family working class, her ambitions, contentment, rather than conquest. Sebastian grew increasingly angry, but Celine remained calm, answering honestly without apology. "I understand your concerns," Celine finally said. "You want the best for your son. But perhaps consider that the best isn't always what looks good on paper." After Celine excused herself to the restroom, Victoria turned to Sebastian. "She's not suitable." Sebastian stood, throwing his napkin on the table. "Neither was Dad, according to your parents. And look how that turned out when you chose suitable over love." He found Celine in the lobby, took her hand, and left. Later, his mother texted, "She's stronger than I thought. Perhaps I was wrong." It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. Inspired by Celine's philosophy of enough, Sebastian began transforming Tech Vault's business model. Instead of endless growth and conquest, he focused on sustainability and employee welfare. He instituted profit sharing, created education funds, built an on-site childcare center. The board was apoplectic, but the employees were energized. Productivity increased, innovation flourished, and surprisingly, profits grew. "Happy people work better," Sebastian told the board. "Revolutionary concept. I know." He promoted from within, elevated women and minorities to leadership positions, created a culture where work-life balance wasn't just rhetoric. Celine visited the office occasionally, always as herself, in jeans and sneakers, bringing homemade cookies for the staff, remembering names and asking about families. The employees loved her, saw her as proof that Sebastian was genuinely changing. "She makes him human," Margaret told anyone who'd listen. "She's the best thing that ever happened to this company." A year after they met, Sebastian knew he wanted to marry Celine. But how do you propose when you're a billionaire who could buy anything? Celine didn't want grand gestures or expensive rings. She wanted meaning, authenticity, truth. He went to the cabin, spending a week alone thinking, planning, remembering Thomas and Sarah's love story. He read through the journal again, finding an entry where Thomas described his proposal. Simple, heartfelt, focused on the promise rather than the spectacle. That's what Celine deserved. Sebastian had the ring from Thomas redesigned slightly, adding small diamonds from his grandmother's jewelry, creating something that connected both their families. He wrote and rewrote what he wanted to say, practicing in the mirror like a nervous teenager. For someone who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals, the prospect of asking one woman to marry him was terrifying and exhilarating. Sebastian planned to propose at the cabin on the anniversary of their first meeting. But life, as Celine had taught him, rarely followed plans. They were at her apartment, doing dishes after dinner, music playing softly, when she started talking about Thomas, about how proud he'd be of Sebastian's changes. "He saw who you really were before you did," she said, hands deep in soapy water. "Just like I did. You were never really cold-hearted, Sebastian. You were just frozen, waiting for spring. Something about the moment, the domesticity, the warmth, the simple truth of her words, made Sebastian know this was it. He got down on one knee right there in her tiny kitchen, soap suds on his expensive shirt, holding the ring. "Celine Throne," he said, voice shaking, You delivered more than a package that day. You delivered me back to myself. Will you marry me? She turned, saw him kneeling, and started crying. Yes, she said, falling to her knees too, kissing him with soapy hands framing his face. Yes, of course. Yes. They wanted something small, intimate, real. But Sebastian's position made that complicated. There were business associates who expected invitations, media to manage, security to consider. Celine grew increasingly stressed, the wedding becoming something neither of them wanted. "Elope with me," Sebastian said one night, finding her crying over seating charts. "Like Thomas and Sarah did. Just us, a judge, and witnesses we actually care about." Celine looked up, hope in her eyes. "But your mother, the board, everyone expects." "Let them expect," Sebastian interrupted. "This is our life, our love, our choice." They married at the cabin 2 weeks later, with only Maria and her husband as witnesses. Celine wore a simple white sundress. Sebastian wore jeans for the first time in 20 years. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising not perfection but effort, not forever but every day chosen again. The judge, an old friend of Thomas's, cried. It was perfect in its imperfection. They honeymooned in an RV, driving across America, seeing the country from ground level. Sebastian had never traveled without an itinerary, private jets, 5-star hotels. But there was something liberating about not knowing where they'd sleep each night, about discovering small towns and hidden treasures. In New Mexico, they watched the sunrise over the desert. In Louisiana, they danced to street jazz. In Maine, they ate lobster rolls on a pier, feet dangling over the water. "This is wealth," Celine said one night as they lay on the RV's roof, watching stars. "Experiences, memories, time together. This is what matters." Sebastian documented everything in a journal like Thomas had done. He wrote about Celine's laugh when she caught her first fish, about the way she looked in morning light, about how she'd changed him from a man who existed to a man who lived. "You're becoming a writer," she teased, reading over his shoulder. "Love makes poets of us all," he replied, quoting something Thomas had written. She kissed him under the vast Nevada sky, and he thought Thomas and Sarah would have approved. They couldn't keep the marriage secret forever. Sebastian called a press conference, standing beside Celine, as he announced not just their marriage, but a complete restructuring of his life priorities. He was stepping back from day-to-day operations at TechVault, focusing on sustainable business practices and philanthropy. "Success without purpose is just accumulation," he said, Celine's hand in his. "My wife taught me that the best things in life aren't things. My uncle taught me that love is the only legacy that matters. I'm trying to honor both those lessons." The business world was shocked, competitors gleeful, assuming Sebastian had gone soft. But TechVault thrived under the new structure. The leadership team he'd been developing stepped up, energized by trust and autonomy. Profits continued growing, but more importantly, the company became known for innovation and employee satisfaction. "You didn't give up power," Celine observed. "You multiplied it by sharing it." Sebastian realized she was right. Real power wasn't control but influence, not dominance but inspiration. 2 years into marriage, Celine discovered she was pregnant. They'd been trying for a year, had begun discussing adoption when the 2 lines appeared on the test. Sebastian stared at it, then at Celine, then back at the test. "We're having a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We're having a baby," he shouted, picking her up, spinning her around their kitchen. The pregnancy wasn't easy. Celine had severe morning sickness, Requiring bed rest for weeks, Sebastian worked from home, bringing her ginger tea, reading to her from Thomas's journal, his hand on her growing belly. "You're going to be an amazing father," she told him during a particularly hard day. "How do you know?" he asked, genuinely uncertain. "Because you're already putting someone else's needs before your own. That's what parents do." They found out it was a boy. Sebastian immediately wanted to name him Thomas, but Celine suggested Thomas as a middle name. "He should have his own identity," she said. "How about Samuel Thomas Not?" Samuel, meaning heard by God, felt right. Thomas would have loved the poetry of it. Samuel Thomas Not was born on a snowy December morning, after 18 hours of labor. Sebastian had never been more terrified or amazed, watching Celine's strength, feeling useless despite his billions. When the baby finally arrived, screaming and perfect, Sebastian cried harder than he had at Thomas's funeral. "He has your eyes," Celine said, exhausted but radiant, as Sebastian held his son for the first time. The baby's grey eyes, unfocused but alert, seemed to look right through him. "Hey, buddy," Sebastian whispered. "I'm your dad. I promise I'll do better than mine did. I promise to choose love over fear, always." The next days were a blur of firsts. First feeding, first diaper, first night home. Sebastian, who'd run a billion-dollar company, was brought to his knees by a 7-pound infant. But Celine was patient, teaching him how to swaddle, how to interpret different cries, how to be gentle with something so precious and fragile. "You're a natural," she said, watching him rock Samuel to sleep. "No," Sebastian replied, "I just have a good teacher. Parenthood changed everything." Sebastian cut his work hours drastically, refusing meetings during bedtime, leaving conferences early for pediatrician appointments. Some called him weak, said he'd lost his edge. But Sebastian had never felt stronger, more purposeful, more successful. He and Celine took turns with night feedings, tagged team during Samuel's colicky phases, celebrated every milestone together. Their apartment they'd kept Celine's place, selling the penthouse, was chaos. Toys everywhere. Spit up on expensive suits, the constant soundtrack of baby noises. It was perfect. "Do you miss it?" Celine asked one evening, as Sebastian gave Samuel a bath. "The power lunches? The conquest? The old life?" Sebastian considered, then shook his head. "I was successful then. Now I'm happy. There's a difference." He lifted Samuel out of the bath, wrapping him in a towel with little ducks on it. "Besides, this is power too. Shaping a life, teaching values, breaking generational patterns. This matters more than any merger ever could." When Samuel was one, they visited Thomas's grave. Sebastian had been coming monthly, bringing flowers, talking to the headstone about his life, his changes, his gratitude. This time, he brought his family. "Uncle Thomas," he said, "this is Samuel, your namesake. And you know Celine, the woman who saved me." Celine placed Samuel's small hand on the headstone. "Tell him thank you," she said to the baby, who babbled happily. "Thank you for the journal, for the wisdom, for believing in your daddy when he couldn't believe in himself." Sebastian added flowers to the vase, purple cosmos that Thomas had loved. As they walked back to the car, Samuel on Sebastian's shoulders, Selena's hand in his, Sebastian felt the presence of everyone who'd shaped this journey. Thomas, the Johnsons from the farm, Maria and her steady friendship, even his mother, who'd finally accepted Celine after Samuel's birth. "You did it," Celine said suddenly. "Did what?" "Became the man Thomas knew you could be. The man I fell in love with in that delivery van. The man you were always meant to be." 5 years later, the cabin was full of laughter. Samuel, now 6, was teaching his little sister Emma to fish with the same rod Thomas had used to teach Sebastian. Celine was pregnant again, glowing in the mountain sunlight. Sebastian's company had become the standard for ethical business practices, but more importantly, he'd become the standard for a different kind of success. They spent every summer at the cabin now, Sebastian teaching his children the lessons Thomas had taught him. Patience from fishing, wonder from nature, love from example. The journal sat on the mantel, joined now by Sebastian's own journals, documenting their love story for future generations. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies, Samuel asked, "Daddy, why do you smile so much?" Sebastian pulled his son closer, his daughter on his other knee, Celine's hand in his. "Because I'm rich," he said. Samuel looked confused. "But Mom says money isn't important." "Not that kind of rich," Sebastian explained. "I'm rich in love, in family, in happiness. That's the only wealth that matters." As the stars came out over the mountains, Sebastian thought about the cold-hearted billionaire he'd been, unable to believe in love, until a delivery driver with warm eyes and endless patience had broken through his iron heart. He'd thought himself powerful then, but he'd only been empty. Now, surrounded by love he'd once thought impossible, he understood the truth Thomas had tried to teach him, that hearts weren't meant to be fortresses but homes, not closed but open, not protected but shared. And in that sharing, that vulnerability he'd once feared, he'd found not weakness but the greatest strength of all. Love hadn't conquered him, it had completed him. And that's the end of today's story. Now I want to hear from you. What lesson did this story leave with you? Drop your answer below. I can't wait to read them all. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our weekly stories. Until next time, stay blessed.